Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for February 10th, 2022. I'm Mark Hillary here in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And greetings to all listeners from Montreal, Quebec. I am Peter Ryan. Happy to be here, Mark.
Thanks, great to see you. And it's great that this week we just heard that in a couple of weeks we'll actually be able to get together in London. So that's going to be the first throughout this entire pandemic, isn't it?
That's right. In fact, a number of us are going to be converging upon London for the launch of a book of a friend of the CX Files podcast, Simon Danchuk, former member of Parliament, who has released a book about the history of Dolphin Square. Quite a scandalous address based on Simon's research, but it'll be great to see a number of the CX community who are going to be attending this once-in-a-lifetime event. And Mark, I'll look forward to seeing you in person, as you say, for the first time in literally 2 years.
Yeah, that'll be great. And of course, any listeners who are going to be around at the end of February, get in touch and maybe we'll see if Simon's still got some tickets. It'd be cool to meet everybody. Now, this week, we're going to be talking to Terry Rybolt. Now, you did this interview with Terry. He's the Chief Revenue Officer at LiveXchange, which is a GigCX platform. Terry's based out in Boston in the US. And we talked to him because he's just published a new book. And actually, it's a book that I co-authored with him. So instead of you and I talking about it, I thought it would be much better if you did the interview with Terry directly. So how did it go? And you know, what did you get out of that interview?
Well, Mark, for full disclosure, Terry is a longtime friend of mine. I've known him well over a decade and consider him to be a personal friend as well as a business acquaintance. And it was a very free-flowing conversation. I got a lot out of it, to answer your question in a very blunt manner. Terry really outlined what I think are the key elements, not just about gig and why gig is becoming a thing when it comes to CX delivery, but also changing trends in the workplace, changing attitudes and changing desires on the part of especially younger people and what they're looking to try and achieve with their own careers and with their own time working in different jobs, etc. Something that really hit home for me with the discussion with Terry is about how he's able to boil gig down into, I think, a few very common sense components about, number one, why there's an attraction for individuals to work using the gig model, why gig can make sense for certain functions or certain industries when it comes to customer experience management, and moreover than anything else, about how the CX workplace is changing and about how organizations, whether it's on the enterprise captive side or the outsourcing side, have to adapt. And when you take these three elements and combine them, what you've got is an output, the book that you folks put together, that you co-authored, and I think really a blueprint for the way gig is going to move forward in 2022 and beyond. And Mark, there's one thing I will say, and the listeners might get an appreciation of this. The book's title is Don't Fear the Gig Worker. And I did make reference in the interview that reminds me so much of one of my favorite songs of all time by Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper. I'm not saying there's any Reaper elements to this book or to the gig model, but the similarity was just too big to pass up.
Yeah, I heard you mentioning the song when you introduced the book with Terry. And I think that song's funny because, it's called Don't Fear the Reaper, and it's about not fearing death. And in the song, there's a line that actually says 40,000 people a day are dying. And so you shouldn't be afraid of it. But I think at the time, even at the time when they wrote that, and that must be, 50 years ago, that song, it was actually about 120,000 people a day dying. So they got it completely wrong anyway. I think that the chat with Terry was great. And I think that what he really manages to get across is, I think there's a few important things. And number one, GigCX is not about crappy jobs and a race to the bottom. You know, when we talk about the gig economy, quite often we talk about, food delivery apps and people really working hard for low wages. And I think that what Terry manages to get across here is how GigCX is actually much more about flexibility for both employer and employee. And so, if you're a gamer, then you can go and do a GigCX work in a GigCX environment supporting other gamers. It's much more about the agent choosing the kind of brand that they want to support and then setting their own hours. So there's really a big difference from that regard. But I think that also the way that he ties it to the Great Resignation and people actually demanding much more flexibility, I think that's also a really interesting angle as well. And we're going to see a lot more of that, I think, as we move into the 2020s. You know, people just sort of not accepting that from Monday to Friday, you need to be in exactly the same place at the same desk at the same time. And if you need to leave at 4 o'clock on a Friday because you've got to go and get your kids early or something like that, it's not acceptable, you know. And I just don't think that kind of stuff washes anymore. What comes across here is it's a much bigger picture that we're talking about than just contact centers and CX alone. I think that what Terry's really talking about is a new way of working.
It is, and that's something I talked to Terry about that our listeners will hear in the interview. The fact that we're discussing not just a change in potentially how people are delivering contact center services, but there's a change in mindset amongst young people. And I use the reference that, Mark, your generation, my generation, and anybody older will recall after the Second World War, there was a real sense that you would go out, you would find a job when you were relatively young, and you would stay in that job or in that company for the rest of your time until you retire. And young people just don't have that same approach. As you say, there's no desire to be chained to a desk for 8 to 10 hours a day anymore. It's very much a case of people want to have a proper balance between their lifestyle and their work. And this is really, I think, one of the core elements at a macro level that Gig brings across.
And I think that you and I could also be good examples of this in a different way. I mean, because what we essentially do are writers, analysts, researchers. I don't know about your contracts with all of your clients, but I pretty much get paid for deliverables. I don't ever have to have a timesheet or talk about how much time I spent on a project. So for me, it's easy. If I want to take Friday afternoon off and I'm ahead of what I'm supposed to deliver that week, then I can just do it. So there's people in our sort of profession, maybe graphic designers, journalists, you know, everybody who's sort of paid by deliverable has already kind of experienced this type of flexibility already.
That's it. No, it's spot on.
Okay, so let's just take a quick look at the news and what's going on in CX this week before we jump into the interview with Terry. I just wanted to throw into the mix a Which study that just came out a couple of days ago, and I thought that it was really interesting. And Which is actually the Consumers Association of the UK, and they published a new survey, which was research into the best banks for customer service in the UK. And right at the top, you had Starling, Monzo, Revolut. And then if you look at the bottom, the worst possible banks, it was HSBC, Lloyds, Barclays. Royal Bank of Scotland, I think, was the absolute worst. And so, you know, you're looking at a complete turning upside down of what we've known. All the traditional brands are now considered to be the absolute worst for customer service. And the startups, the guys that are building apps and then building services around what they think customers want, are just ranked right at the top.
Well, I think it's a wake-up call for the financial services space. And I would dare say that if you were to do a similar survey, perhaps there already have been these similar surveys in the US and Canada and in other parts of Europe, Australia, I'm dead certain that you would find that the traditional providers of these types of services are probably not necessarily on the top of the popularity lists. And there really has to be, I think, an idea brought to the forefront within the boardrooms of some of these more traditional financial services institutions about what's going on. Why do consumers not rate them as highly as perhaps they're rating highly the startups? And why are the startups so much more able to accommodate the desires or the preferences of the consumers who are rapidly flocking to them? I have many friends of mine in the UK. You used the example of Starling, who moved over to Starling, and they love it. They say, do they get everything right 100% of the time? No, but they get things right a heck of a lot more often than some of the more traditional providers. And until there's a realization by the more established players that they have to change and they have to evolve, it'll be like cable television in North America. You're going to see more and more people cutting the cord on a month-by-month basis.
Yeah, and I think that they were hoping for that kind of inertia, that people would keep on trusting the familiar brand and not trusting the startups. But I think that we're well over the hill on that one now. I think that companies like Starling and Monzo are really well trusted now.
Very much so. And Mark, I will say I don't really have anything that would compare from a news perspective that you bring to the table about this survey. Rather, I did want to mention that this week on LinkedIn, there's been a lot of discussion about how it is International Pizza Day, in fact, yesterday. And there's been a tremendous amount of engagement on LinkedIn about the different pizza preferences people have, about the extent to which one very controversial poll was asking the question about if pineapple deserves to be on a pizza or not. And I just thought it was interesting, considering some of the concerns you and I have expressed about how the network seems to be taken over by pointless polls that are being done to surreptitiously push people in a commercial direction. The whole pizza element, I think, demonstrated what fun we can have on a business network and the type of engagement we can have. And I learned about pizzas that I never would have imagined even would have been cooked based on some of the feedback friends of mine were putting up. I think that the call out has to go to Mark Trimble, who talked about different types of grapes on pizza. Mark's an old friend of mine from Saskatoon and has a pizza oven he's very proud of. But certainly the invitation he issued for a great pizza will not be ignored anytime soon.
Well, I have a pizza oven at home as well, but for me, it's got to be traditional, proper Neapolitan, get the flour from Italy and just some tomato and mozzarella. I mean, for me, less is more, definitely.
Well, that sounds like a good recipe too. So I've got 2 pizza oven friends I'm going to be visiting in the foreseeable future.
So why don't we skip over now to the interview with Terry. Terry Rybolt, the Chief Revenue Officer of LiveXchange, and he's talking about his new book, Don't Fear the Gig Worker.
Really happy this week on the CX Files to have a longtime friend of not just the podcast, but of my own personally, Terry Rybolt, who is joining us in his capacity with LiveXchange. Terry, it is great to have you here.
Peter, it's always great to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, the pleasure is ours, my friend. And let me just say, I want to congratulate you on the new book, Don't Fear the Gig Worker. And it takes me back, as I think about that title, to one of my favorite songs of all time by Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper, although very different connotations in this regard. I'm sorry I had to put that out there. But it's really, I think, testament to the fact that gig is such a hot topic right now, and this business model from the CX side of the business is really such an element that's on the tips of the tongue of so many people. It doesn't matter if it's in North America, if it's in EMEA, or any of the offshore, nearshore destinations in the world. But I'm curious, because there was another book that you were involved with related to gig that came out about a year ago. And I'd be curious to find out, Terry, is this a follow-up to that previous edition, or has it got a different message to it?
I would say it's a follow-up to that and an expansion of the topic. As you look at GigCX and it's how it's evolving, even over the last couple of years, things have changed, and so the topics that are in the new book are continuing on the same theme, but we're just expanding on that with more applicability, more thought-provoking pieces for people to consider as they're looking at this as an option.
Okay, that's good context as we get into our discussion today. And I'd like to start from more of a 40,000 foot view, if I possibly could. You and I are roughly of the same vintage. And one of the things that really struck me as I read through the book before we did the interview was a discussion about a change in mindset when it comes to workers in general. And Terry, you'll remember, as we were growing up, our parents probably were the view that you get a job, you stick with a job, you are going to be in that job for potentially the rest of your life, and you should be able to count on a good level of shift working from anywhere ranging from 8 to 10 hours per day. So I'd be curious to get a sense from you, what is what is changing in terms of the mindset of younger people today? Why are they not looking for that same level of engagement and consistency and security that perhaps our generation was, and certainly our parents' generation did after the Second World War?
I have two daughters that are in their mid-20s, and in the conversations that we have about work, it comes down to, a very simple theme, and I believe that theme resonates across the board with this younger generation. And the first piece of it is these people, these millennials want to feel like they're making a contribution and be part of something that's bigger than themselves, which I applaud. The thing that really made me take a step back and think about this, and this is where I totally believe that the gig model fits in the CX space, is they want flexibility. And and the question is, why do I have to go to work at 9 o'clock and end at 5? What if I have objectives that need to be done, can I get them done whenever I need to get them done? And the answer to that is yes, in today's world, because of technology and the things that we have. And as employers are looking at this generation, if they are not offering flexibility, and it's not about just shift flexibility, it's about where they're working flexibility, how they're working flexibility. And if they're not doing that, they're going to be struggling to not just attract talent, but also to retain talent.
Yeah,
my oldest daughter is moving to London, and very excited for her. And she has her company lined up the job and all that sort of stuff. But she's like, "Look, I'm going, and you either help me get there, or I'm going to find somebody else that does." She's saying this to her employer, and she wasn't saying it disrespectfully, but this was something that really, as we were coming up to the ranks, Peter, that conversation would never happen.
No.
And today it's commonplace.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're touching on something in the sense of younger people today know what they want. And I think equally importantly, know what they don't want. And they're willing to be assertive about it. And let's be frank, Terry, in the current era of the Great Resignation, talented young people are in a good negotiating position, much better than, say, when you and I were starting our careers, and that would have been a one-way pink slip.
Absolutely. Within 5 minutes.
Exactly. So on that happy visual, I'm curious from the standpoint of the advantages that you have seen Gig be able to provide CX operations. What would some of the most telling ones be?
As we're evolving this model, one of the key concepts that we are helping companies understand is that this is not a replacement to what you already have. It's an augmentation. And don't stop doing what you're doing, but look and see where this fits, i.e. nights and weekends, i.e. the big seasonal ramps. I saw a report, towards the end of last year where they were talking about, in the US specifically, what the top 10 most coveted jobs or most needed jobs in the US, and the number one thing was a customer service representative. And I started laughing to myself about this, being in this space for as long as I have, where who would have ever thought that would have been the number one sought after position. But it all comes down to that flexibility piece, and looking for people when and where you need them, for however long that you need them. And that's the mission that we're on, to educate that it's not a replacement of, it's an augmentation to what you're doing today.
And I think that's put very nicely in the sense that we're not talking about switching everything over. We're talking about finding a way of using complementary business models to drive the best outcomes for consumers. And if I'm honest with you, this is probably an element of the gig discussion that I think deserves a lot more attention because, Terry, you know as well as I do, people don't like change. It doesn't matter at what stage in life you are. It doesn't matter what your role is. People will do everything they can to try and avoid bringing change or incorporating change into a strategy. And finding that manner to make it the most palatable method as possible is probably going to be one of the biggest game changers in terms of getting that level of acceptability for gig.
There's no doubt about it. And in the relationships that we have today, and these are long tenured relationships, that we are still educating these partners on how to the best fit with this. Because think about this for just a second. If it doesn't matter how much you pay someone, if the gig's only for 2 weeks, nobody's going to be interested in that. So there has to be some legs to this. So we talk about the tenure of the programs. And when we talk about how to engage with people, whether you're a gig worker or an employee, you still need to understand the definition of success and to be helped along that path. But if you're hiring for an understanding of the brand or a general level of capability around something based on your experience, what you really are focused on at that point is how to navigate all the tools and document into the various databases. So a positive customer experience doesn't necessarily need to be trained and followed up on. If you're bringing on the right people, they're picking the shifts that they want to work. You have a much better opportunity for them to be there, right? So your absenteeism issues can be helped resolve. And the second part of it is, you're just training them on how to navigate, and so you can really let them run, but you're still under the operating guidelines of your overall business.
And that raises a good question in terms of the delivery of CX by a gig agent. One of the things I get asked a lot about in my role, excuse me, relates to what does the typical profile or the right profile of a gig employee look like when it comes to customer management? Do you have a sense about what would be some of the more attractive qualities or attributes that a gig agent would bring to the table, Terry?
You're looking at people that have tremendous skill sets. They have the experience. So we're looking for people that have brand affinity. Pick a brand. And they have experience in that brand or in that type of interaction that we're looking for. So for example, I'm looking for somebody that has 5 years retail experience and they have a brand affinity to Canada Goose, for lack of a better term, just using that as an example. Well, you're being able to cast a very wide net to select for that. So now you've got somebody who is passionate about the brand, who understands how to interact with people from a customer experience perspective. So now we just need to help them get up to speed on the tools and the databases. All that being said, what we're seeing is a more experienced person, it's interesting, a person that has they've accomplished certain things in life. They're not looking at this as their primary source of income, but they still want to stay in the game, and they want to augment their, whatever they're doing. And that's the other part of this is there's some people out there that say, look, I want to definitely do this. I just don't want to be tied to a 9-to-5 job. I have the tools, I have the capabilities, but I can work from 4p to 8p on Tuesdays. I can work from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon on Fridays, and I could go all day Saturday and all day Sunday. Well, good luck trying to do that in a traditional employee FTE based model.
Yeah.
But the need still exists.
The need still exists, but equally so does the need exist to find these people. Where would you counsel the best sources to find gig workers would be?
Well, I would say LiveXchange is a good place to start. That's a shameless plug for the company right there.
Yeah, you're allowed.
But what companies need to get comfortable with is, and we talked about this earlier, it's not an either or, it's an and. And so when you look at some of the sites that are out there, Rat Race Rebellion, Flex Jobs, even Indeed, there are certain places like that. For a much broader capability, look at companies like Upwork and Fiverr. I mean, they're really working at this. Uber and Lyft really, blaze this trail, but as this model is evolving, there are lots of plays out there for gig talent, and this is where we see the opportunity for sure.
So, Terry, we've talked a lot about gig in the context of CX at a 40,000 foot view. And I think that's great because we've been able to put some parameters on it. But I'm curious, and I think a lot of people listening are curious as well. Where does gig as a business model in customer management most apply? What would some of the functions be where a gig worker would be exceptionally appropriate as opposed to ones perhaps where they wouldn't have as much application?
Well, when you look at your general customer care, revenue generation, retention, technical support, we've been evolving our discussions with our clients considerably. Languages, multilingual capabilities here. Those are all pieces that you can play, and I really do believe it is universally applicable, and it doesn't have to be whether you're an outsourced provider or a captive audience, because nights and weekends happen whether you outsource or you're in-house. Seasonality, Christmas comes every year whether you are an outsourced provider or an in-house organization. So looking at those types of opportunities to say, where does it fit? How can we make this work? What am I looking for? Those are where I would say, the general applicability of the model is.
And applicability is something that I think is so important for CX managers or executives who are making strategic decisions when it comes to how they're going to deliver the best outcomes for consumers. And as we talked about earlier, change is always a difficult thing for people to get their heads wrapped around. I'd be really interested to know, as you've been evangelizing the gig model and doing a great job of it as well, what are some of the points of resistance that you come up against? What are prospects saying to you might impede them from looking at gig or deploying gig as a way of delivering CX?
Well, first off, thank you for the compliment, and we continue to educate and push this ball up the hill. What we're seeing, and it's amazing, once the executives of these organizations hear it and they can really hear it, the light pops on. And so some of the resistance the questions that we're seeing are about control. I'm not outsourced. How can we outsource to an outsourcer? That's not what we do. We're a technology company that brings the labor and the technology to enable that labor. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot of conversation today around minimum wage things and some of the legal topics that have come up recently around that, whether it's some of the class action stuff, and once people understand how to correctly position this and where to position it and how it fits, okay, that makes sense. And then ultimately, it's about helping them understand where the need is. So we're not saying, let's take 20 people and spread them on a 24/7 hoop. Let's take 20 people and apply them from 4 to midnight, because that's where your biggest challenge is, and really stepping that back and helping them to see where those challenges are, not just see them, but also understand that this is a way to help resolve that challenge. Recruiting today, I have great respect for the recruiting organizations inside of companies, because that job is so challenging today. Yeah. And doing the same thing, we all know the definition, doing the same thing the same way over and over again and expecting a different result, we know what the definition of that is. So lifting your head up to see alternatives, again, not a replacement of, but an augmentation to what you're already doing. And that's how this fits.
Okay, so last question. Give me your vision for how gig is going to evolve in the CX domain through 2022 and beyond. I know it's a how long is a piece of string, but if I'm going to ask anybody how long this piece of string is, it's got to be you.
I see gig evolving outside of North America. I see gig evolving around multilingual capabilities. I see gig evolving from a very specific spot to a much more broader application. And I will give total credit to the Upworks and the Fivers of the world, where they've, their model is every company needs a little gig in it. And I think that's brilliant. And so as I think about this incorporated into CX, you look at the CAGR numbers for gig over the next 3 to 5 years, and it's like a 17 to 20% growth rate year over year. So we've already proved that work at home can work. And that was a long time coming. Unfortunately, it took a global pandemic for that point to be proven. But now you have the intersection of work at home and the gig economy, and the growth of this. Will it continue to evolve? Of course it will continue to evolve, but it's not going away. I think about e-commerce, the early days of e-commerce, where you could buy something online and there was no sales tax applied to it or anything like that. Yep. And then suddenly, as it evolved, well, okay, we're going to start collecting sales tax on this. Did it change? Did e-commerce go away? No, it's actually blown up even more. And that's how I see gig. Will it continue to evolve? Absolutely. But it's not going away. And I think as companies continue to look at options, this is where they're going to start to really understand the applicability of this as well.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of people that will resist an evolution of how this work's done. And Terry, you and I have been around this industry for at least a couple of decades, and how many people said non-voice will never take off, it's going to stay 95% telephone? How many people said work at home is never going to happen, it's going to all stay in center? And the reality is, the way we work changes, the way people consume CX changes, and there's going to be an intersection that's going to cause these evolutions to happen. And I really look forward to seeing how gig plays out, because I think it is a very disruptive, in a positive way, doing business from a customer management standpoint. So I said it was my last question, but this really is my last question. For all those listeners out there that are interested in reading the book, Don't Fear the Gig Worker, where can they access this book?
Well, you can grab it on Kindle. Right now, it's released on Kindle on Amazon, so you can definitely go there. And for folks that are listening to your podcast, if they want to shoot me a direct message on LinkedIn, I'm happy to send them an e-version of it as well, just because I want to help you and what you're doing with CX Files.
And the CX Files greatly appreciates your friendship and your patronage, Terry. Thank you very much. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and 2022 holds a lot of promise for Gig. I am excited to see how it plays out.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.